it's lovely to have you here with us, and we're so pleased that we could have this conversation and talk a lot about your paper that you've done. We've all really enjoyed working on the paper with you, reading it, learning from it. Could you tell us a little bit about the impetus behind the research and really the impetus behind the essay?
Well, it's a pleasure to do this, to both work with you on the paper and to do this event. I've been reporting and editing and working as a journalist in the Arab world since around 1970, so about 50 years. And I've watched the modern development and de-development of the region for half a century and reported on it as a journalist. So I was in touch with daily life, people's feelings, and I traveled a lot around the region, and I wrote about economics, I wrote about maternal and child health, I wrote about archaeology, I wrote about politics. So I was in touch with every dimension of life. And what I noticed in the last about 25 years or so, actually since just after the end of the Cold War, the region shifted. It shifted from a developmental trajectory that it had pursued almost nonstop since around 1925 till around 1970 and till around 1990. And what happened after 1990, more or less, is the region kind of stumbled and started to decline. And I saw it happening in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, everywhere I went. I could see this on a daily basis, talking to people. And then when the uprisings happened, the first round in 2010, that was pretty much predictable. But then people continued to protest. And there was wars, and there was uprisings, and there was on and off protests. And then the second round happened in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq in 2019, 2020. And it was around that time when I realized that there was something structural in this region that needed to be better understood. I thought I could do that because I had lived through it, and I knew the sentiments of both ordinary people and people in the power elite and whatever. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to give readers a better understanding of why the Arab region, and we're talking about the Arab region, we're not talking about Israel, Turkey, Iran, though they play a role tangentially. But I wanted readers to understand why the Arab region is so violent, so messy, so inconsistent in its trajectories, political, social, economic, environmental, why there are so many pressures in this region, why so many people want to immigrate. About a third of young people want to immigrate. They would just want to leave forever. And I thought I could do that because I'd been reporting and writing about these issues for decades. And we have now available, which we didn't 20 and 30 years ago, we have available large amounts of public opinion surveys, polling. There's tremendous amount of knowledge about how ordinary people feel that wasn't available to us before. So I wanted to put this together. And then when I saw that the uprisings in Sudan, Lebanon, Algeria, and Iraq were continuing into their second year, that's when I said, look, this is the focal point. Why have we had a decade of nonstop mass popular uprisings by citizens who were clearly distressed about many things? And I just wanted to identify all that and let people understand better. So that's how this project started.
For those who haven't yet had a chance to read the paper, what would you say are your three main key takeaways? What are the three highlights you think that the reader should come away with having read the paper?
The first really important point is that we have in the Arab region, and I use the term Arab region, not the Arab world, because it's not a single Arab world. It used to be very much more unified politically and culturally and ideologically, but it's not anymore. We have across the Arab region a really critical phenomenon that is the foundation for all of the terrible things going on, the violence, the wars, the terrorism. And it is the mass pauperization. The Arab region is a region of poor people. About 70%, according to UN data, about 70% are poor and vulnerable people. And that definitely has increased in the last year because of the COVID and oil price dropping and economic slowdowns and other things. So we're probably up to around 75%. 3 out of every 4 Arabs is poor and vulnerable. And they're all politically totally neutralized. They have no political power. They vote in make-believe elections. They have fake parliaments. They have controlled media. They go through the steps of expressing themselves or trying to influence policy, but they have no impact on policy. They're powerless, pauperized people who have simply reached the end of the line. They can't go on anymore. They can't feed their kids. They can't get jobs. They don't have public transport. They don't have clean water. Electricity doesn't work. The hospitals don't work. And they've given up politely asking the government, please do this, please do that. So that's the main underlying issue, the mass pauperization of a helpless citizenry that has risen up across the region. And that'd be probably the second point, which is the demands of the protesters all across the region are virtually identical. I noted them all down, studied them, looked at them, analyzed them. They're all the same. And that's understandable because they've all had the same experience of being mistreated by their government. Also, they feel mistreated by Israeli colonization, Iranian penetration, American, British, French, Turkish, Russian intervention. I mean, there's other things that they don't like, but it's their internal degradation by their own societies, whether it's the government, security agencies, public sector, private sector, whoever it is, and therefore they have done the only thing that is still available to them, which is to rise up in the streets and try to overthrow the governments. And the third notable thing is that the main demand now in the 4 countries we look at, Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq, is to get rid of the entire government system. This is so important to understand. Years ago, for the last 50 years, we've always had demonstrations and protests where the people want to reduce the price of milk or increase the salaries of teachers in the schools, the single issue demands and protests. Now the demands across the entire region are get rid of the whole system. The whole system is corrupt, it's ineffective, it's inequitable, it's degrading the citizens of these countries, and we don't think it's reformable. So those 3 things I would say are the most important things that people should understand about what's going on in the region. And of course, what they triggered was a militarized response from the states. That's another issue we'll get to later.
Well, you mentioned the 4 snapshots and the 4 countries that you talk a little bit more about in detail. While the report, of course, does cover the entire region, there are 4 specific sort of snapshots that we look particularly at, and these are Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose those 4, given the wide range of dynamics in the region of protest?
I chose those 4 countries because the protests have been ongoing for about 2 years now. I mean, this is a sustained, intense protest process that captures the majority of citizens. Majority is not out on the streets, but we know from polling evidence that 60, 70, 80% of citizens support the protesters. So these are mass national uprisings. And they've been going on for years now. And they are all asking for the same thing, and they are not giving in to the physical abuse from their own governments, being shot, being detained, being imprisoned, being intimidated, and they're not giving in to fatigue. They see no other choice. They don't have a life in their present condition. They can't continue like this. Their kids are going to die of starvation or lack of medical care or something. And therefore, these 4 countries are noteworthy because of the intensity, the breadth of the uprisings, the intensity of the uprisings, and the continuity of them. That's something unusual. But when you put it in the wider context of the last decade, which is what I've tried to do, and these protests today were similarly done in Egypt, Bahrain, Tunisia, Syria, Libya, many other countries in the region. So you essentially have had about 2/3 of the 22 Arab countries, about 2/3 of them have had major episodes of either occasional or continuing uprisings in the last decade. So this is a decade of a mass citizen rebellion across the Arab region. And this is really noteworthy. There's no other region in the world where the entire region has undergone something like this. You had a little bit similar in the old Soviet Union days, but it only happened simultaneously at the very end when the whole system collapsed. Before that, you'd have the Czech revolt and the Bulgarians and the Germans. Each one would do a little bit of an Polish. They each do a little bit of an uprising, but never have we had an entire region virtually simultaneously rising, the citizens rising up against their governments and their systems, and this is noteworthy.
Right. Well, you mentioned de-development, and I think that was a really important term. De-development and pauperization as two very important drivers of these uprisings. Can you give us a sense a little bit about the commonalities of the grievances? You're saying that there is a convergence of grievances in not only these 4 case studies, but throughout the region. Can you give us a sense of some of the breadth of the grievances?
The fascinating and important thing about the grievances is not just how common they are across the entire region, but how universal they are within each country. In other words, almost every dimension of life has caused citizens to rise up and protest. Housing, schooling, education, water, electricity, justice systems, police abuse, fake political systems, controlled media. Every dimension of life, environmental issues, every dimension of life has become problematic for ordinary citizens. You have a small elite, maybe 15% of the population, 20% between very rich people and upper middle income people, about 20% of the population are fine. They have electricity generators, they have extra water reserves, they don't run out of electricity, they don't run out of water, their kids get jobs, they go to good private schools. But 80% of the people of our region are not fine. They're terribly suppressed and oppressed and depressed, and they don't see how they can get out of this situation. The difference now, and 30, 40, 50 years ago, which I remember well, is that before, when you had a problem with unemployment or healthcare was poor, you could usually get it fixed by going to the government, by going to foreign donors, the private sector. You could get it fixed because there was usually one problem at a time. Now, the citizens don't see a route to fixing their problems. They don't see a way out of their dilapidated, degraded human condition. And it's the degradation of this individual citizen is matched by the degradation of the entire state. I use a term which I don't know if I invented it or not, I don't think so, but I like it a lot. It's de-sovereignization. These countries have lost their sovereignty. Many Arab countries now cannot make sovereign foreign policy decisions unless they get the approval of foreign powers. Could be Iran, could be Saudi Arabia, could be Israel, could be Turkey, Russia, the US. Some foreign power has to give you approval. Most Arab countries cannot survive without significant international financial and security assistance. Some Arab countries cannot, or most Arab countries cannot buy the military equipment they want to defend themselves unless the Israelis approve it, because the Israelis will tell the Americans, don't let this happen. I mean, this is a reality. So these are de-sovereignized countries, de-sovereignized states that essentially look to foreign military and political support to maintain them in their present condition, and they neglect their own citizens. So this combination of issues really is what defines the condition in the Arab countries which has led to this intense and sustained mass popular uprising.
Well, de-sovereignization, that's a word we're going to have to keep using, I think, over and over again. And I have a question about that. You mentioned the 1990s as a turning point, and you're talking about de-sovereignization. When do you think they were sovereign? Or do you think that there was never a sovereignty? Or do you think there is a moment that an ideal sovereignty was achieved and then there was a turning point? And if so, what do you think was the turning point that led towards de-sovereignization?
That's a really important point, and historians really have to weigh in on this. From the work that I and other journalists have done and other analysts, I would say that the Arab world, the Arab region, the Arab states that were essentially born around World War I in their current shape, never had a chance to become solid, stable, sustainable, and effective states, countries. And the reason is really three things. One, the foreign military intervention in our region has not stopped since Napoleon. Since 1798, there's been nonstop foreign military intervention. And if you look around the region today, it's worse today than it was 20 years ago and 50 years ago. And you've got all kinds of people fighting in Libya and in Yemen and in Syria and Iraq, and at will, they just go and test weapons, do it. So massive international military intervention, creation of modern countries that were largely created by European colonial powers, not all of them, but most of them, that were never able to achieve the validity that countries need from their own citizens. We've never had self-determinant, self-validated Arab countries because the people who made decisions at the birth of these countries were either foreign colonial powers or a small hand-picked elite, minorities usually, that worked with the foreigners, and they then took control of the state. And then immediately what happened in the 1940s and 50s is these states were largely taken by military forces, their own military forces. The Iraqis, the Syrians, the Egyptians in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And then you had Gaddafi, Ali Abdullah Saleh, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. You had this whole string of military officers who took power in these Arab countries. And of course, the mother of them all was the military officers who took power in Egypt in 1952, and ever since then. So once military forces took control of these countries, and many of them were closely allied to foreign powers, the developmental trajectory of these countries essentially was sealed, was doomed. That these countries developed reasonably well, as I said, for 50, 60 years, because their populations were modest, the governments had money, they were supported internationally. But by the 1980s and early 90s, population growth had way outstripped economic growth. International interest in our region after the Cold War declined. We were no longer strategically interesting to anybody or important. And population growth and mismanagement and corruption by Arab governments, heavily influenced by the rise in oil prices starting in the early mid-1970s, you could watch it. I lived through this whole trajectory and watched it happen day by day almost. And so by the 1990s, we had small minority Arab governments that were not validated or supported by their people, were not serving their people, depended on foreign support to exist, and essentially had no sovereign control over their resources. And recently, we've seen in the last 10 years, many Arab governments, not all of them, but many of them have no sovereign control over their borders. The flow of money and arms and people and drugs and immigrants and terrorists across the borders is unbelievable. So all of these things have to be seen as a package and as one package. But it really started, it was that transition from colonial manipulation of new Arab countries that were largely foreign created with local minorities, transitioning then to military control which were then developed into corrupt, personalized governance system because of the massive amount of oil money in the region. When that trajectory, essentially, to me, says that the Arab countries never really were fully sovereign. They were independent, but they weren't sovereign. And we've seen the consequences of this in the last 10 years. To have a whole decade of nonstop uprisings across 2/3 of the Arab countries is really something quite astounding. And the world needs to understand the reason for this. This isn't just because Arabs and Muslims are violent people or whatever. It's not because of the madrasas. It's not because of they don't give women enough rights. It's not because of the issues that are often talked about around the world. It's because the fundamental humanity and the fundamental citizenship of individuals and the collective citizenry have been degraded and denied to them by their own power elite that works in cahoots with foreign governments.
I mean, your paper talks a lot about this broken social contract, right? The fact that it is this tremendous inequality, this 15% that manages well, and then everyone else who doesn't. And the fact that there's a sense of powerlessness in terms of politics. How does that tremendous inequality and some of the dynamics you've mentioned about disappointments on the part of the citizenry, the sort of predatory nature of governance that you've described in the paper, what does that mean for the kinds of government reforms that can come out of such uprisings? And certainly the cases, the snapshots you mentioned have very different outcomes. To your mind, where can the uprisings go in terms of government reform?
Nobody knows where they're going to go. We've never had a situation like this in the Arab world, or maybe even anywhere in the world, possibly on a collective regional basis. The reason is that there's no other entire region in the world, Africa, South America, East Asia, there's no other entire region that has been chronically and collectively non-democratic, autocratic, corrupt, inefficient at governance, and uncaring about their own citizens. The whole region, more or less, with a few tiny little exceptions here and there, has been like this. And we're the only region in the world where this has been the reality. And that's why we have this situation of the uprisings everywhere and the intensity of the uprisings now. What's happening now is more intense than it was 10 years ago when it started in Egypt and Tunisia. And the link between this reality and the inequality across society is direct and it's intense. And it's masses of people, majorities of people that simply do not know how they're going to continue to live biologically. This is not about ideology, it's about biology. They need nutrition, protein, water, safety, shelter, and social connections to physically exist as human beings. And many of those things now, they don't have access to them like they used to. They did for the last 100 years or more, or even going thousands of years when I've written books on archaeology, and you've seen this trajectory throughout history. The problem now is that the population growth has become so big. There was 60 million Arabs in 1930. There's now about 440 million. The water supply hasn't changed. The productivity of the societies has nominally changed, but corruption has increased. So that the trajectory of economic development, national management, that would sustain a citizenship increase from 60 million to 440 million, that process has not happened. Therefore, we've had mass poverty, and governments have let a lot of their people slip into poverty, and they let other people take care of them. Tribal groups, religious groups, Muslim brothers, foreign donors, UN systems. Somebody will feed people. Today you see it with refugees. 50,000 refugees suddenly flee northern Iraq. Somebody comes in and sets up a camp and gives them food and water. The governments don't care. They leave this to somebody else. So it's really that trajectory that we need to understand is built on this growing inequality and the psychological and then the political impact that has on the individual citizen who he or she feels that they've been dehumanized. So this is a biological dehumanization, which then translates into political acts and ideological acts. Some of these people, the majority of people who become desperate, try to find ways to get on with life. And most of them find somebody to help them, the neighbor, their cousins or something. Some of them immigrate. Not many can, but some of them immigrate. Most of them have to just figure out how to get on with life. And they do, but a small number of them drop out of this system and go and join extremist groups or terror groups or create their own new groups. There's been a proliferation of these. And the governments haven't been able to handle it. International counterterrorism has limited the impact of terrorism, but not stopped it. And then the reason is because the supply of desperate people has only increased in the last 10 years. And the inequality and pauperization combined with political total helplessness really is the key to understanding why that's happening and why it'll continue. And the repression in return that Arab governments have exercised, and it's not just Arab governments. What's interesting now is all over the world, you see governments resorting to repression. But most Arab governments, faced with a rebellious, pauperized, desperate citizenry, reply with security measures. You notice the armed forces and the police and the intelligence agencies, they're all super well equipped. They're all dressed like they're going on a TV show or movie set with incredible guns and equipment and sunglasses and all the gadgetry. So if they've got all this money to equip their security forces, why can't they have decent high school teachers? That's the question that people ask. So the militarized Arab state is the response to the pauperized Arab citizenry. And it won't work. Historical realities, we know it. You can hold people down so much with military security. And if you look around recent history, the Shah of Iran, Marcos in the Philippines, the whole Soviet system, all of these countries and regions tried to use military force to suppress people, and in the end, they couldn't do it.
You will shift slightly the focus, because I thought this was a really interesting part of your paper and something we've certainly seen in some places, but maybe not talked about enough, is that intersection of sport and culture with the dynamics of protest and politics. And I thought it was really interesting the way your paper describes, how the football chants, how the crowds in football, the poetry and the songs at protest. I'm a big Liverpool fan. We just saw a huge political outcry with this European Super League. And certainly we've seen, football be political and politic in many countries. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are seeing kind of that intersection of sport and culture and political expression coming out in the last decade?
The fascinating thing about that is that it is also universal. Look at the black athletes of color in the United States today. They wear on their uniforms Black Lives Matter. Sports is an arena where everybody can participate and everybody can express themselves. The political elites tried to suppress this in the Arab countries and the US, but they couldn't in the end, mainly because there was too much money to be made and mainly because it gave people a release of stress and tension to go root for their sports team. But the reality is that sports have always been a venue of mass human expression. And in our context, the football games, the soccer games, matches have been places where, tens of thousands of people together would chant phrases that were critical of the government. And the government couldn't arrest 20,000 people, and they don't know there's no leader. Who do we arrest? What do we do? This was a favorite mechanism, especially in North Africa, But you also get it a little bit in other Arab countries where fans will start singing. They make up these songs and they make up these chants talking about how the government has humiliated me, how the rich people make money and I'm starving and I can't find a job. My only hope is to get on a boat and try to immigrate illegally to Europe or die in the sea. And when people are asked, why do you risk dying in the sea? They'll tell you, because I'd rather risk dying in the sea than dying of hunger in my own home. And you have this expression coming out with people I interviewed in Lebanon, and I've read about interviews with people in Iraq and other places where individuals who are in the streets, especially during Corona, they're asked, why are you out on the street demonstrating? Aren't you afraid of dying? And they say, no, I'm not afraid of dying because I'm already dying. I have nothing to live for. I don't have a job. I don't have money. We don't have water. We don't have electricity. Medical care is not really available. So I have nothing to live for. I'd rather die on my feet trying to make a better life for my children or my younger brothers and sisters. That's what they feel, that they've kind of reached the end of the possibility of improving their life through the traditional systems of pleading with governments or making a small demonstration. And that's why they don't see any possible reforms other than a wholesale removal of the existing system. Now, that's really hard to do. That's why they haven't really broken through. Tunisia made a breakthrough, and it's a little bit problematic still now. Sudan has this transitional process, which is fragile. But you can't quickly and easily remove an entire power structure that has had 30 or 40 years to work with a lot of money and guns and arms, and has developed clientelist networks of supporters and dependents who will fight to keep them in power, like people fought to keep Ceausescu in power in Romania, but in the end they couldn't. And that's why the protest movements are basically saying, get rid of this entire political class. And they're working, this is one of the important things that I point out in the paper, people are working at the community level quietly, mostly women doing this work, by the way, which is important, working to create the blueprint for a better Arab society, constitutional, pluralistic, tolerant, participatory, accountable, rule of law, gender equal. All of the things that decent people want are being planned by groups of Arabs in different places, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately. And this is what they're trying to chart out. How, if we got rid of the government, how would we replace it? And they've got transitional processes. So they're saying we need a transitional government for 6 months to stabilize the economy, re-inject foreign money that's legitimate money, whether in loans or donations, get expatriates to come back and put their money in, and let these economies grow again and give people hope and a decent life. So the protesters are not just wild-eyed, irresponsible people saying, get rid of the ruling class. In 2010 to 11, when they burst out onto the streets in Egypt and Tunisia and other places, they didn't have these plans. That's why the transitions didn't work. So in Syria and Libya and Egypt and other places, the military ruling elite came back and stayed in power. In Bahrain, you had the Saudis and other Arabs who came and helped keep the elite in power, because the protesters had not thought about the transitions. They didn't expect the regimes to fall so quickly. But now there's a different system. People are trying to figure out how to make a transition to a better life for the citizens of Arab countries.
There's a really poignant story in your paper about the protester and the soldier, and I think it was Lebanon, where somebody yells at the protester, "Why are you protesting?" He says, "I'm hungry," and then the military guy, the officer, says, "Well, I'm more hungry."
That's right.
And that really stuck with me, because it's also a reminder that the militaries and the armed forces and the police are drawn from the same population that is experiencing these dynamics. And I wonder if you can just speak briefly a little bit about what does that mean when your military and your police force that you are using to suppress, repress, react, to these protests, but they're drawn from the same social mix, and they're experiencing maybe many of these same grievances. How long can it last if you're drawing your repressive force from that same population? If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure, that's actually a pretty easy question to answer, because we've seen it happening over the last 40, 50 years in many countries that had uprisings and demonstrations and the regime fell or didn't fall. Iran, Romania, Philippines, many countries have gone through this. The answer is very simple. There's two things that will make any government fall: if they run out of foreign exchange, and if the soldiers refuse to shoot their own people. Those are the two things you should look for. There's other things that matter, but those are the two critical ones, which in my lifetime, I've seen this happen over and over again. In most of the Arab countries that are going through these terrible times, they've long ago had foreign exchange problems and are living on debt. And of course, their debt goes up to 80 billion and 100 billion, and these incredible figures that they'll never pay back. So they can still get some foreign military and financial support. But the critical link is the security and police and military units. Will they keep shooting when they're ordered to shoot at these demonstrators, when they may be shooting at their cousins or their neighbors? And this is what that little story in my text shows, that the military, the soldiers, are just as bad off as the ordinary people. Their salaries in Lebanon, for instance, their salaries have lost 70, 80% of their value because of the collapse of the value of the currency. But they're still hanging in there. They're still clothed, and they're given food, and they have access to medical care. So they get just enough benefits to stay in the system that they've worked for all their life. But what's happening in the broader society, and we see this in Iraq, we see it in other countries, the sectarian support, so people who support religious leaders or political leaders of different religious or ideological movements, those supporters have traditionally been very tight, and they would never turn against their leaders. I would say about half of them in these countries now are no longer blindly following their leaders, because their leaders have let them get into this terrible situation where they're desperate. And so there's still a lot of sectarian support for individual, Shia, Sunni, Druze, Christian, whatever, different movements, groups. And these are, of course, also funded from abroad, whether Iran or Turkey or Saudi Arabia or who knows. But the sectarian support, like this military support, the solidarity of the military people and the sectarian groups, they're starting to fray at the edges. They haven't collapsed yet, and that's why the system holds together, especially Iraq and Lebanon, which are based on sectarian division of power between different religious groups. But that system has collapsed. It's failed, and it's just on its last legs now, and it'll go soon. I don't have any doubt about that.
Well, I think this will probably be my last question, but I would prefer to just stay here all day and continue this conversation, which is why we thought it would be helpful really to do this. I guess my last question will be about the seismic shift you talk about in a mindset that has gone from single issue protests to taking, in a way, a step back and thinking not just about the immediate issue maybe that used to be, the subject of protest. You mentioned housing, schooling, employment, and now it's a much more inclusive approach. People are thinking about gender rights, human rights. You talked about the roles of women in the paper. Why this seismic shift now? Is it youth? Is it internet? Is it people at the end of their tether? I mean, it's a really extraordinary idea, that move from single issue protest to mass governance reform, and to do it collectively in multiple states. So what do you think is the key sort of catalyst for why we're seeing this seismic shift at this time?
I think it's very clear that we have this level and breadth and intensity of protest and uprisings across the Arab region today because a majority of citizens no longer can live a decent, normal life. We didn't see big uprisings in the Arab world from the 30s until recently. There was a couple. You had the overthrow of Nomadi in the mid-80s in Sudan. You had a couple of uprisings against Saddam Hussein, but they were more sectarian, mostly Shiites and Kurds against the oppressive central government, which oppressed everybody. But we've never had this kind of mass uprising to change the whole system. We do now because the majority of citizens simply cannot biologically continue to see their life going on. They don't see how their kids are going to get education, jobs, and live a decent life. It just is not visible at all to them. And therefore, they've become desperate. And they've started taking to the streets. And what happened was an important development across all of these countries that I write about. Once the people took to the streets, and it started in small numbers, 10,000, 20,000, maybe 50,000 people out of a population of 5 million or 20 million. But once you get 50,000 people in the street, they all realize that they're different identities, different religions, sometimes different national groups. You can have Kurds, you can have Armenians, you can have Circassians, you can have Druze, you can have people who are not ethnically Arab, but they're citizens of that country. They have different identities, but they realize they're all suffering from the same thing. And their suffering, their collective communal suffering, is stronger than the individualistic identities that had kept them separated into silos that reported up to their sectarian leaders, who in the end turned out to be a corrupt oligarchic mafia. And in Lebanon, they call it the mafia state. And so this is what happened. Citizens started to realize that all of them across the board are suffering for the same reasons. And geographically, this kicked in. This was so clear, and it started in Egypt way back in the uprising in 2010, but in Lebanon and Iraq and Algeria, when a protest happened in Beirut, if the police would come and crack down on it, the protest would erupt in Tripoli, and then it would erupt in Sidon in the south. And the same thing in all the Arab countries. In Iraq, it would be Baghdad, and then Nasiriyah, and then other Basra. So there was a national scope to the communal degradation of individuals and entire communities. And that kicked in when protests started to happen, and they were all protesting at the same time to support themselves. And they'd carry banners when Beirut demonstrations were suppressed. The people in Tripoli would carry banners, "We're with you in Beirut," and they'd get on buses and come to Beirut. And the same thing happened in Algeria. In Algeria, when the government shut down some protests in the capital, protest groups immediately emerged in the provincial cities, and they held up banners, the same thing. So it became a national revolt. And you can't put down a national revolt with the policemen that you have, however well trained they may be. And so that's, I think, what we're witnessing now. We're witnessing the national cross-sectarian nature of the uprisings of these pauperized, desperate citizenries. And once it reaches that scale, it's eventually going to have an impact. What they haven't been able to do is to force the governments to resign. They haven't forced them to flee, as happened in other Arab countries like Egypt or Tunisia and other places. But now what's fascinating is all of the governments, the four that I write about, the countries, all of the governments immediately made offers of concessions. They said, "Oh, we'll have a new election. We'll arrest the president," as they did in Sudan. "We'll prevent Bouteflika, the president of Algeria, from running for his 5th term, when the guy was almost comatose. He could hardly move. He was so ill. And they were putting him up to be elected for the 5th term in a row. And the governments made all these concessions, said, "Okay, we're not going to do this. We'll have a new election. We'll increase the investment in rural areas." But it was too late. You can't do that at that point. And that's why these mass protests have continued. Where they're going to lead, nobody can guess. But my instinct, watching this process, living through it, is that they will prevail ultimately. But they will prevail probably through a negotiated mechanism that leads to transitional governments. Sudan is the most important place to watch right now, because they're going through a 3-year transition. And I think that's inevitable. The danger is that these processes will not be allowed to play themselves out because of foreign interference. Whether it's the Iranians, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Turks, the Americans, the Russians, who knows, but foreign interference will say, no, we can't let these people run their own democratic countries. And this has been the dilemma of the modern Arab world, the modern Arab state system, that foreign powers, political, ideological, military, economic, whatever, have not allowed our region to develop true democratic, participatory, and accountable mechanisms of governance. And that's what people exactly are asking for.